It was a regular night, or at least I thought it was. The kind of night where everything seemed perfectly normal, nothing out of the ordinary. The wind gently rustling the leaves outside, the distant hum of the city, and the soft creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. But little did I know, tonight would be different. Tonight, something would change that would haunt me forever. I had just moved into the old house on Elm Street. You know the type. The kind of house that seems a little too quiet, a little too empty. The kind where the shadows linger longer than they should, and the silence almost feels like it's pressing in on you. It wasn't my first choice, but after my recent breakup, I needed to get away from everything, clear my head, maybe find some peace. What I didn't expect was that the house, with all its charm and creaking wood, would become the thing that would unravel me. It was a 2-story house with an attic, located at the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown trees. The kind of place people whisper about in town, but no one really wants to talk about too much. The house had history, some of it good, most of it bad. The neighbors never seemed to stay for long. The realtor had brushed it off as old house quirks, but there were things that didn't sit right with me from the beginning. As I settled in that evening, I began unpacking boxes, rearranging the furniture. It wasn't long before the house started to feel less like a home and more like a place where things didn't belong. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the air felt thick, heavy. The light from the old lamp on the table flickered from time to time, casting strange shadows across the walls. But I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing. After all, every old house had its quirks, right? The moment I locked the door for the night, that was when the first strange thing happened. It was a simple sound at first, just a creak coming from somewhere upstairs. I assumed it was the house settling, a natural noise. But then I heard it again, followed by a faint tapping, like footsteps in the attic. I stood there for a moment, frozen. The air seemed to change, becoming colder, denser. My heart began to race, and I shook my head, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. "It's just your mind playing tricks," I whispered to myself, stepping into the living room to shake off the unease. But as I stood there, trying to convince myself it was nothing, something else happened. The floorboards above me creaked again, but this time it was unmistakable. It sounded like someone was walking, slowly, deliberately, moving through the attic. I swallowed hard, staring at the ceiling, trying to tell myself it was just the house, nothing more. But deep down, I felt something was wrong. It was the way the noise seemed to get louder, closer, as though something was moving towards the attic door. I stood there, tense, unable to move, until the footsteps abruptly stopped. I glanced toward the attic stairs, then back to the door, unsure of what to do. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. "It's nothing," I muttered under my breath. "Just the house, the old house. It's just settling." I tried to convince myself of that as I walked across the room, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was in the house with me. I quickly made my way to the kitchen, trying to get my bearings, but as I passed by the hallway, I caught sight of something odd in the reflection of the mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move behind me, something dark, a figure just out of my peripheral vision. I whipped around, but there was nothing there, just the empty hallway stretching back into the darkness. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the silence of the house play tricks on me. But the more I tried to dismiss it, the more the feeling of unease grew. As the night wore on, the house seemed to grow quieter, heavier, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then it came, the sound. It was faint at first, just a whisper, like a soft rustling, followed by a distant voice. I couldn't make out the words, but it was a voice, one that didn't belong in the house. At that moment, I knew I wasn't alone. The house was awake, and whatever was inside, whatever had been waiting, was now watching me. As I sat there, frozen in place, I couldn't help but think back to the warning I had heard from the old woman at the corner store when I first moved in. She had looked at me with cold, knowing eyes and told me, "Whatever you do, don't look behind you." I laughed it off at the time, thinking it was just a strange coincidence, or maybe the ramblings of a superstitious old woman. But now, as the night pressed on, I wasn't so sure. The air grew heavier, and the whispering in the house grew louder. I could feel the eyes of something unseen on me, as though it was waiting for me to do something, waiting for me to make a mistake. And as the tension reached its peak, I realized I was standing at the edge of something far darker than I had ever imagined. Something was coming, something was waiting, and it was telling me, in no uncertain terms, not to look behind me. The days that followed felt strange. I don't know how else to describe it. It was like the house had settled into a rhythm, a steady pulse, and every time I walked through it, I could feel it. The creak of the floorboards under my feet, the way the wind seemed to blow just a little too hard against the windows at night. It all felt deliberate, like the house was alive, and it was trying to tell me something. But I ignored it. I convinced myself it was just the house settling, just my imagination running wild. But then, things started to change. Subtle at first, like whispers at the edge of my hearing, but soon enough, they were impossible to ignore. It started with the sounds again, those strange, persistent creaks coming from upstairs. It wasn't the house settling. I knew that now. I'd lived in enough old places to recognize the difference between a house shifting and something else entirely. The noises weren't random. They had a pattern, a rhythm to them, as if someone or something was moving around up there deliberately. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, and I could hear the soft scrape of footsteps across the floor above me, slow, measured, like someone walking just out of sight. I tried to reason with myself. "It's just rats," I told myself. "Old houses get pests." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew I was lying. The steps weren't like the scurry of tiny feet. They were too heavy, too deliberate. And they always stopped right above my room, as if the thing, whatever it was standing just over me, watching, waiting. One night, I decided to confront it. I grabbed a flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest, and I headed for the attic stairs. I didn't know what I was expecting to find. Maybe a leaky pipe, maybe a bat or two. But I had to check. The air in the hallway was thick, heavier than usual, and as I approached the attic door, the floor beneath my feet seemed to groan with a sense of dread. But I pushed forward. I had to know what was going on. I reached the top of the stairs, and the door to the attic was slightly ajar. I paused for a moment, the beam of my flashlight shaking in my hands. There was an undeniable pressure in the air, a sense of something being wrong. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that terrible gnawing sensation that something was about to happen, that I was on the edge of something I couldn't understand. I took a deep breath, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The attic was dim, the air stale and musty, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if they were alive, moving just out of sight. The beam of my flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw something, just a flash, something at the far corner of the room. But when I turned the light in that direction, there was nothing. Just old boxes, dusty furniture, and forgotten relics of another time. I scanned the room, my heart pounding, but the more I looked, the more it seemed like the room was waiting for me. There was something off about the place, like it had been disturbed. A feeling, like an electric charge in the air, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The room was too still, too quiet. I felt like I was intruding on something that didn't want to be found. That's when I saw it. In the farthest corner of the room, partially hidden by an old, cracked wardrobe, was something out of place. a large blackened stain on the floor. It looked like someone had spilled ink or paint, but it was different. It wasn't the texture of any liquid I'd ever seen. It was almost like the stain was a part of the wood, as though it had been there for years, soaking into the fibers of the floor. I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and as I bent down to inspect it, I felt a cold gust of air brush past me. It wasn't from the window, which was closed tightly, but it was so cold, it made my breath catch in my throat. My pulse quickened. The temperature in the attic had dropped several degrees in just a few seconds. I straightened up, my eyes scanning the rest of the room, and then I saw it. A figure standing just behind me in the corner of the room. I whipped around, my flashlight beam scattering across the attic, but there was nothing there, just shadows and dust. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I felt my heart racing, pounding in my ears. Had I imagined it? Had I been so overwhelmed by the tension that I'd conjured up a figure in my mind? I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light maybe. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Something was wrong. Something was here with me. I turned back to the stain on the floor, my eyes narrowing as I tried to make sense of it. And that's when I noticed something else. Something far worse than I could have imagined. The stain, the dark mark on the floor, wasn't just a stain. It was moving. Slowly, ever so slowly, it seemed to shift, as if it was alive, stretching across the wood like a living thing. My mouth went dry, and my body froze. I couldn't look away. I didn't want to look away, but I couldn't help it. The stain seemed to pulse, growing larger, darker, as if it were reaching out towards me. A voice, faint at first, whispered in my ear. It was a voice I didn't recognize, but it felt familiar, like it had always been there, waiting to speak. The words were indistinguishable, like they were being spoken through water, muffled and distant. But as the stain reached closer, I heard it more clearly. "Don't look behind you." The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it was so clear in my mind it felt like it was coming from the very walls of the attic. I turned, slowly, my body trembling, my heart in my throat. And there it was, standing just beyond the threshold of the door, the figure I had seen earlier, the one I thought was a figment of my imagination. It was a person, but not entirely. Its shape was twisted, distorted, like it was only half there, like a shadow made of solid darkness. Its eyes, if you could call them eyes, were hollow, two empty pits of blackness that seemed to suck in all the light around it. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over an old crate. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I tried to call out, but no sound escaped my lips. The figure stepped closer, its footfalls eerily silent, and I could feel the cold air growing stronger around me. I wanted to run, to escape, but my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in place by a force I couldn't understand. And then, it spoke again. The voice, so soft, so deadly. "Don't look behind you." I knew then, with absolute certainty, that whatever was in that house, whatever was waiting for me, was not of this world. It was something ancient, something dark, and it had been watching me since the moment I walked in. It knew me. It knew my fears, it knew my every step, and it wasn't going to let me leave. It was the middle of the night when I first truly understood that I wasn't alone in the house. Up until that point, I had told myself it was just my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me, fueled by the isolation of the house and the strange noises that seemed to come out of nowhere. But that night, something happened that made all the doubt disappear, and the terror I felt became undeniable. I had been tossing and turning in bed, unable to fall asleep. The air in the room was thick, almost suffocating, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the usual kind of quiet. It was a stillness that felt unnatural, like the entire place was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I had grown used to the occasional creak of the floorboards or the faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, but tonight was different. Tonight, I felt a growing sense of dread that wrapped itself around me like a cold hand. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. It was just the house settling, just the wind playing tricks. But the longer I lay there, the more I could feel it. An unsettling presence. Something that seemed to be lurking just beyond the edge of my consciousness, waiting to make itself known. And then it happened. It started with a sound, a faint scratching noise that seemed to come from the wall behind my bed. At first, I thought it was just the house groaning, as it often did. But the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic to be just a natural noise. It sounded like nails dragging slowly across the surface of the wall, like someone, was trying to get my attention. I froze, my heart thumping in my chest, my eyes wide open in the darkness. The scratching continued for a few seconds, then stopped. For a moment there was silence again, but this silence felt different. It felt like something was watching me. My breath quickened, and I felt a cold sweat start to form on the back of my neck. The room seemed to grow colder, the air heavier. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I pulled the covers tightly around me, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the blanket. I was too terrified to move, too scared to even breathe too loudly. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be causing the noise. Maybe it was an animal, something that had gotten into the walls. But even as I tried to convince myself of that, I knew it wasn't true. The scratching had been too purposeful, too controlled. It had been something or someone trying to make its presence known. And then, as if to answer my unspoken fear, the scratching started again, this time louder, more insistent. The sound seemed to echo through the walls, growing closer like it was moving toward me. I felt a wave of panic wash over me, my body frozen in place, unable to do anything but listen as the noise continued. I wanted to scream, to call out for help, but no sound left my mouth. It was like the very air had thickened, making it impossible to speak, to move, to escape. The scratching reached a crescendo, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. And then, just as I was beginning to think I had imagined it all, I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from the hallway outside my room. At first, it was faint, just a soft tapping of shoes against the wooden floor. But the sound grew louder, closer, until I could hear them coming down the hallway toward my door. My breath caught in my throat, and I held my own breath, praying that whatever it was would pass by, that it would go away. But it didn't. The footsteps stopped outside my door. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, shallow and uneven, like someone, or something, was standing just beyond the threshold, waiting. My pulse raced in my ears as I strained to hear any movement, any sign of what was out there. But there was nothing, only the sound of breathing and the horrible silence that followed. And then, in the dead of night, as if the house itself had taken a deep breath and exhaled, I heard the faintest whisper, a voice, low and distorted, coming from the other side of the door. "Let me in," I gasped, my body tensing in shock. The voice was guttural, unnatural, and it sent a wave of ice-cold fear through me. The words seemed to hang in the air like they were pressing in on me, suffocating me. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I just lay there, frozen in terror, unable to comprehend what was happening. The door handle rattled. I could hear the faint sound of fingers scraping against the metal, turning the knob slowly, deliberately, as if whatever was on the other side knew exactly what it was doing. I wanted to scream, to shout, to run away, but my body refused to obey. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even blink. All I could do was lie there waiting for whatever was outside to get inside. The rattling stopped, The house was silent again. For what felt like an eternity, I lay there, too scared to move, my body trembling with fear. Every second felt like a lifetime, each one stretching out as I waited for the next terrifying thing to happen. But nothing did. The silence returned, as if nothing had happened at all. Eventually, I gathered enough strength to pull myself up from the bed, my limbs shaky, my mind racing. I crept over to the door, heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I reached for the handle, but as soon as my hand made contact with it, the door slammed open, throwing me backward onto the floor. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting around the room, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, the darkness stretching out before me like a void. There were no footsteps, no breathing, no whispering, just the sound of my own ragged breathing in the silence. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was real. It wasn't just in my head. The house wasn't just old and creaky. There was something else here, something that didn't belong, something that wanted to make its presence known. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the scratching, the footsteps, the voice. I could still feel the pressure of that cold, unseen presence looming over me. And I knew, deep down, that I had made a terrible mistake by staying here. I had ignored the warnings. I had brushed off the strange occurrences. But now, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I was trapped, and whatever was in this house wasn't going to let me leave without a fight. The days after the first scare felt like I was living in a constant state of heightened awareness, my senses constantly on edge. It was as if the house had transformed overnight into something else, something that wasn't quite right, something that had changed the moment that door handle rattled and that voice whispered my name. But at the same time, I tried to hold on to some semblance of normalcy. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I was overreacting, that the fear was just a product of too much isolation. But deep down, I knew better. The following night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It wasn't just the unease I'd felt before. No, this time it was different. It was as if I could feel the eyes of something, or someone, following my every movement. Every step I took seemed to echo too loudly in the quiet of the house. Every breath I took seemed too heavy, too noticeable. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in, and there was no escape. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure, those hollow eyes, that twisted shape standing just beyond the edge of the light. It would never move, but I could always feel it there, lurking in the corners of my vision, waiting. It was always just out of reach, always on the edge of my thoughts. And the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the feeling became. So I did what any rational person would do in this situation. I decided to leave. But when I went to pack my things, I found that my bags had already been emptied. Clothes, toiletries, everything I'd put in my suitcase had been removed. And in their place were old, yellowed photographs I didn't recognize, strange trinkets, and items that seemed completely out of place. Worn shoes that weren't mine, books I had never read, and what looked like a collection of old, broken jewelry. I didn't understand what was happening. I was paralyzed with confusion and fear. How had this happened? Had someone broken into the house? But no, I was sure the windows were locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. Panic set in, and I was suddenly overwhelmed with the feeling that I had to leave. I couldn't stay here anymore. I couldn't even be in this room, in this house, where everything felt wrong. The house was no longer just a place. It was a trap I had walked into without realizing the consequences. That's when I heard it again, the scratching. This time it was coming from downstairs. It was much louder, sharper, like claws scraping against the walls. I stood frozen in place for a moment, paralyzed by fear. I wanted to call out, to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. It was as if the house itself had placed some invisible force around me, holding me in place. The scratching grew louder, closer, and then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, it stopped. I waited for a few moments, my body trembling, trying to gather enough courage to move. But when I did, my feet felt heavy. The air around me seemed thick, suffocating. I knew something was watching me. I could feel its presence like a shadow lurking just behind me. It was as if every part of the house, every room, every corner, was alive with malevolent energy. I crept down the hallway, my hands shaking, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Every step felt like it was taking me deeper into some kind of nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I reached the stairs that led down to the main floor, and as I descended, I felt a chill wash over me. The temperature had dropped again, and the air was thick with an oppressive silence that was worse than any sound. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. The front door, which I was sure I had locked earlier, was wide open. The wind outside was howling, and the trees were swaying violently, but I couldn't take my eyes off the door. It was as if the house had invited whatever was out there to come in, to find me. I took a few hesitant steps toward the door, my mind racing, but I couldn't move any closer. The threshold felt like an abyss, and standing at the edge of it made the very air around me feel as though it were pressing in. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow and deliberate, they echoed from behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The house was empty. I was alone, or at least I should have been. But the footsteps kept coming, closer, closer. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place as the sound grew louder, closer, like someone, or something, was walking right toward me. The footsteps stopped just behind me, and I could feel the temperature drop another degree, the air thick with tension. And then I heard it again, the voice, low and raspy like it had been waiting for me all this time. "Come closer." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but my body refused to obey. It was like I was caught in some sort of trance, unable to break free. I turned slowly, and when I did, I saw it. There, standing in the corner of the room, was the figure, the same twisted shape I had seen before, only this time it was closer, much closer. Its hollow eyes were locked onto mine, and I could feel its gaze bore into me, chilling me to the bone. Its form flickered in and out of focus, like it wasn't entirely real, like it was something that had crawled out from the shadows of my own mind. I took a step back, but it wasn't enough. The figure took a step forward, its movements jerky, unnatural. It was getting closer. The floorboards creaked beneath its weight, and its breath, if you could call it that, came in shallow, rasping gasps. I tried to scream, to fight back, but no sound escaped my throat. The fear had taken hold of me, and all I could do was stand there, paralyzed, as the thing, whatever it was, drew nearer. Suddenly the figure lunged. I didn't see it happen. One moment, it was standing in the corner of the room, and the next, it was right in front of me. Its cold, skeletal hands reached out, grabbing at my arms, pulling me toward it. I tried to struggle, but its grip was too strong, like iron bands around my limbs. And as it pulled me closer, I could feel its icy breath on my face, cold as death itself. The world around me began to fade. The walls of the house seemed to dissolve, and I felt like I was falling into some abyss, some dark place I couldn't escape. My vision blurred, and all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, the harsh rasping of its breath, and the whisper that seemed to echo in my skull. "Don't look behind you." In that moment, as the cold hands of the figure closed around my arms, everything around me seemed to stop. The house, the walls, the air, It all vanished. I was no longer in that room, no longer in that house. I was somewhere else, somewhere dark, deep, and endless. The figure's grip tightened as it pulled me closer, and I could feel the coldness seeping into my very bones, draining the warmth from my body, my soul. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost in the void. I was helpless, trapped in a nightmare that felt so real, so tangible I could hardly breathe. But just as I thought it was all over, as I was about to be swallowed whole by whatever this was, something snapped inside me. I don't know what it was, a moment of sheer defiance or perhaps the last remaining shred of my will to survive. But suddenly, with a strength I didn't know I had, I wrenched myself free from its grip. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my chest heaving, the room spinning. The figure, however, didn't move. It just stood there, watching me with those hollow, dark eyes, its breath shallow and rasping. It was as if it was waiting for me to make the next move. And in that moment, I realized something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't trying to kill me. Number It was trying to keep me here, in this place, trapped, forever. I backed away, my body trembling, my mind reeling. I didn't know where to go, what to do. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape, but I knew I couldn't. The house had already swallowed me whole, and no matter how far I ran, no matter how fast, I would never be free of it. The very walls seemed to close in around me, trapping me in an endless maze. The door was still open, but I knew it was a lie, an illusion meant to keep me here, in this nightmare. The figure didn't move. It just watched, its presence suffocating, like it was waiting for me to accept my fate, to surrender. That's when I realized the truth, the horrible, terrifying truth. I had seen this before, all of it, every single part of it. The scratching on the walls, the footsteps, the voice, the cold, the figure. It was all connected, all a part of a story that had been playing out long before I even stepped foot in this house. The house wasn't just haunted by some restless spirit. Number It was a prison, a place where souls were trapped, unable to move on, cursed to relive their worst fears over and over again. And I had become a part of that curse. I wasn't the first to fall victim to it. The house had claimed others before me, and it would claim others after me. But that didn't make it any easier to accept. The terror that had gripped me, the feeling of being hunted, of being chased by something I couldn't escape. It wasn't just my fear. It was the fear of those who had come before me, their spirits lingering in the walls, in the air, in the shadows. I was no different from them now. I was just another lost soul, another victim of the house's dark power. And then, in the midst of that realization, something changed. The figure didn't just stand there anymore. It began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it took a step toward me, its body shifting, twisting, like it was made of smoke and shadows. And with each step it took, the darkness in the room seemed to grow deeper, more intense. The walls stretched, the corners of the room disappearing into an abyss that seemed to have no end. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by the force of whatever was happening. My vision blurred, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow. The figure loomed closer, its twisted form growing more and more solid with every passing second. And then, I heard it, the voice. It was the same distorted, guttural voice that had whispered to me before, but this time, it was louder, clearer. It was speaking directly to me. "Why did you come here?" it asked. The voice was so close now, so close that I could feel the words vibrating in my chest. "Why did you think you could escape? You should have known. You should have known that there is no escape from this place. No escape from me." The room seemed to pulse with its words, the air thick with an unnatural energy. I could feel the walls closing in, could feel the weight of the house pressing down on me, suffocating me. I tried to scream, to call for help, but my voice was lost, swallowed by the dark. The figure stepped closer still, and this time I couldn't look away. I didn't want to look away. It was as if I had no choice but to watch as it drew closer, its form becoming more and more distinct, more and more terrifying. Its face was a twisted mask of rage and sorrow, its eyes hollow and black, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. It reached out, and I could feel its cold fingers brushing against my skin. And then, everything stopped. The darkness, the terror, the figure. It all vanished in an instant. I was standing in the same room, in the same house, but it was as if nothing had happened. The air was still, quiet once more. The figure was gone. The darkness was gone. And for a moment, I wondered if it had all been a nightmare, if I had imagined it. But then I saw it. The photograph. It was lying on the floor just in front of me. The same photograph I had seen earlier, the one I didn't recognize. But now, as I picked it up, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. There, in the background of the photo, was the same figure, the same twisted shape. And in that moment, I understood. The figure wasn't just a spirit. It wasn't just a manifestation of fear. It was me. I had been trapped in the house all along. The figure, the voice, the terror. It had all been me. The house had taken me, twisted me into something unrecognizable. I wasn't a victim. I was the one who had become part of the curse, the one who had become part of the house's never-ending nightmare. I had become one of them. And as I stood there holding the photograph in my hand, I knew that the house would claim more victims, just as it had claimed me. More souls would come, drawn in by the same force that had lured me here. And they too would be trapped in the endless cycle of fear and darkness. I turned around, and for the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt nothing. No terror, no panic. Just an empty, hollow feeling as I accepted my fate. I wasn't going to leave. I couldn't. No one ever could. And the cycle would begin again. The house claimed another. I don't know how long I've been here. Time doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't exist in this place. The hours blur together in an endless, suffocating fog. I am no longer the person I was when I first stepped into this house. The terror, the fear, the darkness. It has changed me, twisted me into something unrecognizable. I've become a part of the house now, a part of its curse. I remember when I first arrived here, full of curiosity, full of life. I thought I could control my own fate. I thought that if I stayed calm enough, kept my wits about me, I could escape whatever was lurking in the shadows. But I was wrong, dead wrong. There's no escaping the house once you've been marked by it. There's no running, no hiding. It knows you, it knows your fears, your weaknesses, your every thought. And it doesn't let go. I've seen things no one should ever have to see. I've heard things that can't be explained by any rational mind. The house speaks in whispers, in cracks in the walls, in the shadows that move when you're not looking. It plays with your mind, toys with your reality, until you can't tell what's real and what's not. And all the while it waits. It waits for you to break, to give in. But now I've given in. I've accepted it. There's no point in fighting anymore. The house has claimed me. And in the end, it's not just the house that traps you. It's your own mind, your own fears. They become part of the house, part of its power. The more you resist, the more it feeds on your terror. The more you try to escape, the more you get sucked in. I wish I could tell you not to make the same mistake I did. I wish I could warn you, beg you to stay far, far away from this place. But the truth is, I don't even know if you can. Once you've heard the whispers, once you've felt the cold breath on your neck, once you've seen the shadows that shouldn't exist, it's too late. You're already marked. If you ever find yourself here, if you ever hear those voices, If you ever see those eyes, just know this. It's already too late. You won't escape. You can't escape. The house doesn't let go, and neither does the fear. I am the house now, and the cycle continues.